Hi, welcome to session 13, the final session of History 3380, World Civilizations. Now this session has only one half to it, unlike all of the other sessions that we've done. That's because the second half would normally be a review, but that review will be on the website for the course, and that way, of course, it can be updated as we go year to year in terms of the recording of this course. What I want to focus on in this one half session is a summary view of what we've covered in the course. And it is, in its own way, assisting you in terms of preparation for the exam, because it also helps to put things in perspective, focusing on, well, what were the key issues that were covered, both in the first half, but also more importantly in the second half of the course. If we go to the first slide, what I've tried to do in the course is to look at the evolution of human societies over primarily the last 500 years, and to see how human beings as well as their own environment have changed over the course of that period. So we began by looking at the world as it was, in other words, the world before modernity, before more or less 1400, 1500, you can almost pick your own date. And what we've tried to do is look at how did many of the social relationships, economic systems, political systems, ideological systems, how did they change over time? How were human beings changing? First of all, if we look at the world before modernity fully embraced the globe, we know that human societies largely were organized around two types of social relationship. One was kin groups, meaning extended families. If we talk about clans in China or tribes in Africa, we're talking really about extended kin groups, where there is some type of real or at least mythic family relationship that's assumed in how people organize themselves, and they call upon one another to carry out a variety of functions, including governance and economic activity, based on the fact that they are related to each other. The other form is clientelage, particularly feudalism in Europe would be a good example of this, although we saw examples in Africa as well, where there is a relationship of a dominant group or individual with subordinated groups, and there is some type of contractual relationship, although it may not be written down, where each takes on certain obligations to the other. Let us say a feudal lord who is obliged to protect the peasants, and the peasants, of course, who are obliged to work on the land of the lord. They have a mutual relationship. One is superior, the other is dependent, but they do have mutual responsibilities towards each other. Most people found themselves living in some such human society as we look at the pre-modern and early modern world. And it's not to say that these types of relationships have disappeared, particularly kin group relationships, because they still exist. But they have ceased to be, in many ways, the principal means by which people organize themselves. And we'll look more at that in a few minutes. Another striking aspect of human societies before modernity was the fact that we could largely group people into two types in terms of the way their societies were organized, not just along kinship and clientelage relationships, but also the kinds of living environment that they chose to pursue. One was the agrarian environment, where people had settled down about 5,000 years before the contemporary era. They first began to do this, began planting and cultivating seeds and creating agricultural communities, sedentary groups. And the other were, of course, nomadic peoples who essentially made their living by moving across vast distances to engage in such activities as hunting and gathering, herding of animals. So we have two very different types of basic activity carried out by these two types of societies. And before the coming of the modern age, the numerical distinction between agrarians and nomads was not terribly great. I mean, we had vast numbers of people in Africa and Northern Asia and elsewhere who were nomads. But as we proceed through the centuries, and certainly by the time we come to the 20th and 21st centuries, the percentage of people on the face of the earth who could still consider themselves to be nomads has been drastically reduced, where they've become a very small fraction of that population. A radical shift, both in terms of numbers and power, from the time of, let us say, the Mongol Empire. That a nomadic empire which proved to be the largest land-based empire ever created on the face of the earth. Critical in terms of cultural activity was religion. Religion represented not only spiritual fulfillment for people, but it also represented a vast accumulation of knowledge. If you're looking for people who would be considered scholars in pre-modern societies, more often than not, they were not purely scholars, they were fulfilling some type of religious function as a priest, as a shaman, etc. Much of this had to do with studying the movements of heavenly bodies or various features of the physical world, because it was believed, of course, that the divinity was either an actual physical presence, such as the sun, or that divine will was manifested through physical phenomena. So these people did gather up enormous amounts of information about how the physical world worked. In addition to providing that sort of storehouse of knowledge, religion also gave meaning to human existence, not only in a spiritual sense again, but also in terms of dealing with the world. How do we deal with the seemingly random events, which may be of a very positive or negative nature, that have happened in life? Well, religion could offer an explanation and could offer perhaps mechanisms for dealing with negative events, how to appease the gods, for example. At the same time, religion served another function, both offering, in some instances, criticism of the existing culture and society. Think of the rise of Buddhism within Hindu India. Or, on the other hand, conferring legitimacy on a state system. Virtually every ruler in the pre-modern world, and even in the early modern world, staked their claim to rule based on some type of divine imprimatur, divine approval. So religion served a great variety of functions, and inevitably, even though there were systems of political philosophy as well, or social philosophy, like Confucianism, like the Greek philosophers as well, despite that fact, overwhelmingly, human societies were penetrated thoroughly by religious beliefs, religious institutions, religious practices. Again, we're going to see some change in that as well. The great empires of the pre-modern world were substantial by all means. We look at the Roman Empire, the succession of empires in China, and they were pretty significant size. But by the standards of later imperial structures, think of, again, the Mongol Empire, think of the great trading empires that we talk about, these empires were relatively small compared to what would come in a later era. And more than that, they lived in relative isolation from one another. Yes, the Silk Roads would help tie the Roman Empire to ancient China, but this was a thin and very limited sort of connection. The Romans were not about to go invade the Chinese or vice versa. In addition to this physical isolation, which existed among pre-modern empires, these empires inevitably were based on tribute payments from peasant populations. This is how the state funded itself. Well, trade played a role. Every empire of any significance had trade as an important part of its economy. Nevertheless, the overwhelming element was tribute based on agricultural production. This provided a steady source of resources for the state, but it also limited the extent to which income, revenue would grow over short periods. It was very difficult to radically expand tribute collections without causing serious disruption. because it was unlikely, given technological levels of the time, that agricultural production could be radically increased over the short period. So the only solution would be to tax the existing peasant population more intensively. And when that happened, as it happened in China, for example, you usually wound up setting off a peasant rebellion. So these are stable, but not highly dynamic economic units. Both production in agriculture, but also transportation, by which trade might be carried out, reflected the limits of technology. Just as a single example, ocean-going voyages were deemed to be highly dangerous. They were usually very limited. People stayed within sight of the shore, did not try to go over vast distances because their vessels, their knowledge, and their technology in general for finding their location on the world map were all very limited. But change was coming to the early modern world, as we've seen. Climate change in particular. And what that climate change meant was that about 3 centuries of warming climate led to increased agricultural production because of longer growing seasons or multiple growing seasons, where you could have 2 growing seasons in a single year, for example, in what were otherwise temperate or cool climates. Followed by the beginnings of a cold era in the Earth's climate, which reversed that process, putting tremendous strain not only on agricultural populations, which have been expanding because there'd been more food, because seasons were longer in terms of growing, but also putting tremendous pressure on nomadic populations because the additional grazing area, which they had enjoyed for a time as climate warmed, was now being significantly reduced. And these people went looking to expand that grazing area, to expand their resources in the face of declining returns from their herding and hunting ventures. This helped mobilize, set in motion, nomadic populations throughout Eurasia. In other words, the entire area from China all the way to Western Europe and much of northern Africa as well. The most striking example of this was the Mongol Empire, which, although it enjoyed really no more than 200 years of even superficial unity, in other words, it did not remain a single dominant empire for terribly long by at least the measures of historians, nevertheless represented, again, the greatest land-based empire ever created. And it was the product of a mobilized nomadic people, the Mongols pouring out of northern Asia and sweeping across the plains all the way through what is modern-day Russia and into the eastern reaches of Europe. One of the most important impacts of this first nomadic empire was the stabilizing of overland trade routes. Again, if we look at relative importance, land routes are more important at this time than seagoing routes when it comes to long-distance trade, because they don't face the same kinds of technological challenges that ocean-going trade faces. So even though it's more expensive to move goods by land, nevertheless, it was less risky than going by sea. However, in the centuries leading up to the creation of the Mongol Empire, even land-based trade was seriously impinged upon by political instability, as a variety of different groups, they may be organized societies, they might simply be bandit groups, preyed upon the trade routes that ran across Eurasia. What the Mongols did was provide stability, put an end to these incursions upon the trade routes, and helped renew vibrant trade crossing this vast land base. Of course, trade always brings other things, ideas, as we were talking about the other day, and also disease, as we've seen throughout the course. And in this instance, the stabilization of land-based routes was one of the contributing factors to the spread of the Black Death. The Black Death, of course, did massive amounts of demographic damage in China, in India, the Middle East, and of course, Europe, that we looked at most closely because there we have the most complete records. Without getting into a lot of detail of, well, what did the Black Death do again, clearly it was a highly disruptive force, at least as disruptive as the mobilization of these nomadic populations. It helped weaken the Catholic Church, which was the true unifying institution in Europe at this time. It created a power vacuum in the Mediterranean as leading city-states that had dominated, particularly the Eastern Mediterranean, were weakened and would set off another power struggle over who would dominate the Mediterranean. And these changes eventually led to a fusion between the nomadic warriors who had been mobilized by climate change and the sedentary groups who had formed the basis, the economic and demographic base of the old empires. And we would have, out of this, a fusion between nomadic groups and sedentary groups. We would have a new kind of empire created, one that incorporated both the military prowess of the nomadic warriors, particularly their ability to fight on horseback, to move rapidly, and the advantages of sedentary civilizations, which included various forms of bureaucratic administration and a steady source of revenue from tribute payments. So we sort of get a blending of the best of both worlds if we're talking about what do you need to create larger, more expansive imperial systems. And of course, what we're talking about is the emergence of the trading empires. Listed here are some of the most significant ones: the Ottomans in the Mediterranean, the Habsburgs, who would vie with the Ottomans for control of the Mediterranean, come to control much of the Western Hemisphere, the Portuguese and the Dutch and the English, all of whom established important trading empires in the Pacific and the Indian Ocean, and to some extent also had a role to play in the Western Hemisphere. And finally, the Ming, included because they were, as of 1500, when we can certainly say that we have now entered the early modern period of history, they at that time were still by far the most powerful empire in the world. But they were not of the same characteristics as the other trading empires in two important ways. One, the Ming, rather than being expansionist, were very much trying to conserve the existing imperial system that they controlled. They were not looking to expand outward, quite the opposite. They were increasingly anxious to wall themselves off in terms of influences from the outside. And while they still remained, without question, perhaps for another 2 centuries, the largest economy in the world, that was because they represented the largest market in the world. They were a huge internal market for goods to be sold. The other empires are reaching out to try to seize control of important trade routes and tax or monopolize that trade, whereas China, its economy is generating wealth largely because of the huge market that it represents and its consumption of products from the outside. A little bit like the United States today, which more and more may be becoming the biggest market in the world, as much as it may be, at least now, the biggest economy in the world. These expansionist trading empires, with the exception, again, of China, used basic technologies which had been emerging for centuries. Gunpowder, new types of sails, the lateen sail, the triangular sail, and knowledge of ocean currents and winds in order to expand not only territorially, but even more importantly, in terms of trade. And this is really what distinguished these empires. As much as the Ottomans and others could expand and seize territories, even more importantly, they were gaining control over vast networks of trade that ran, in particular, over the oceans of the world. They traded primarily at this time precious goods, spices, silks, silver, gold, human beings. That was made necessary in part by the existing technology. Even ocean-going vessels were very small, and whatever goods were going to be shipped in them had to have a very high value per unit. Otherwise, it simply would not be a paying proposition. What this meant was that these empires were creating opportunities for very rapid increases in resources, something that really hadn't been possible with the traditional model, if you will, of empire building that had existed back in the age of the Roman Empire. Because now, well, agriculture and tribute payments imposed upon agrarian society were still the largest source of revenue for any one of these empires. They had a growing source, one that was growing much more rapidly, in the form of this type of long-distance trade. So this allows an accelerator effect to take place, that as they gain control of trade routes, their revenues go up, they're able to purchase additional elements of technology in terms of new types of ships, sails, weapons, to further expand their reach. And it's a result of that, this rapidly growing control over long-distance trade, which can produce dramatic increases in revenues, and their additional purchase of technologies, which allows these empires to extend their reach in a way that the pre-modern empires could not even have imagined. The age of the trading empires has a profound influence on these societies. And I should say profound influences, really, because there are so many of them. But the ones that we've focused on are the ones that impacted Europe, and there helped set off a series of changes that led to the creation of the first set of modern societies. Among the changes that are most significant in bringing on this process, and it's one that's extremely complicated, is still highly debated as to which factor might have been primary and what group of factors, but nevertheless we can with reasonable certainty say that one of the most important ones was the flow of silver from the Spanish Empire in the Western Hemisphere, because that inundation of European markets with American silver set off price inflation, the price revolution. Suddenly goods started costing a great deal more. What that meant was that groups in European societies, particularly landlords, were going to have to seek new ways of generating wealth. That the traditional method of simply collecting feudal dues from peasants was not necessarily going to keep them receiving the kinds of revenues that they needed in order to keep up with inflation. A phenomena that largely they had not experienced in past history. Silver also meant additional capital available for people who wanted to try new and innovative ways of producing goods. So basically the capital pool was expanded. Another critically important development arising out of the creation of the trading empires was the slave trade along with sugar production. The slave trade itself provided tremendous profits for European powers, not just the Portuguese, but the British, the French, and others. So it became another source of large amounts of capital. More than that, slaves provided the labor force for sugar production, especially in the Western Hemisphere. What that meant was that we had a series of essentially industrial plants being created in the agrarian sector that relied on methods of mass production, large-scale production, in order to create sugar. That meant not only profits again and capital available for experiments in other areas, but it also established a basic familiarity with methods of mass production. Even before factories with plumes of smoke rising from their chimneys begin to emerge in Europe, some of the basic methods on how factory production would be organized were already being experimented with in the sugar industry. And more than that, the basic idea that what you want to do is not worry about having control of a limited resource whose small amount gives it a high price, like spices, silks, but rather what you wanted to do was produce a product on a mass scale whose price may not be all terribly high, but when you're selling millions of units of it, millions of pounds of sugar, you can make extraordinary profits that go far beyond anything that was produced by the trade in precious goods of an earlier time. What we find in Europe are the beginnings of capitalism. Not only a new economic system, but a new way that people would organize themselves. As capitalism spreads, the old clientage relationships of feudalism would begin to disintegrate. And in later centuries, it would have a profound effect on kin group organizations, whether in Africa, China, or elsewhere. Not that they would dissipate, but that another way of organizing society would increasingly become more important. And that was wage labor. That this is the new way that people will organize themselves for economic activity in society, not based on clientage relationships, not based on kin relationships, but based on the payment of wages. We see the beginnings of this in stark form in the Enclosure movement in England, where the old feudal relationships between landlords and yeomen, or peasants, give way as the landlords begin enclosing the land and driving the peasants off in order to employ people for wages to herd sheep. Because the main issue now is not that you have a protective relationship with peasants and the peasants provide you with an army and with a labor force to grow crops. Now the main issue is how much profit can I make? I don't need the peasants. In fact, they don't really need me anymore as modern state systems emerge to provide stability and protection. But the old feudal relationships break down and give way to wage labor. In turn, another step in the direction of factories is the putting out system, as merchants put into the hands of peasants the tools, namely looms and weaving machines, to make thread and then to make textiles. This is another step in the development of capitalist production because, again, what we're really dealing with is a wage labor system. They're being paid, may not be by the hour, but nevertheless they're being paid a wage to produce product, and their relationship with the merchant is not based on kin group, it's not based on feudal relationships, it's based on the payment of a wage. Factories are a further step in this direction because they allow the owner to closely supervise those who now work for him. Instead of the looms and the spinning wheels being left in the countryside, where supervision would be at best minimal and sporadic, now everyone was sitting at a loom or spindle in a room being watched by a supervisor to increase output, increase discipline. And along the way, create opportunities for specialization of function. where rather than having a single person take all the steps from spinning the thread to weaving it into cloth, you break that up into a set of distinct, specialized functions which different individuals will undertake because they're more efficient. The textile revolution gives way to the development of steel and iron plants, which in turn make possible the development of a transportation revolution, the rise of railroads and steamships. So we now have not only a modernized capitalist method of production for goods in both agriculture and industry, but also we have a highly advanced transportation system made possible by the new products produced in capitalist factories. Along the way, and enhancing this development, was the development of revolutionary thinking, new ways of looking at things. And again, it's not easy to say, well, the capitalist development came first and then the revolutionary thinking, or the revolutionary thinking came first and the capitalist development. They are in many ways two parts of an evolving process. But with the religious Reformation in Europe by the 1500s, we are starting to see an emphasis on individual responsibility, on the importance of the individual. That was an important message that came out of the Reformation. We shouldn't leave all aspects of religion up to a group of priests. We are personally responsible. And we should have some control over religious activity. An idea that had in itself the germ of the concept of democracy. The Enlightenment further accelerated this changing viewpoint as Enlightenment thinkers brought to bear even more forcefully something that Reformation thinkers had been doing, and that was the idea of applying one's rational thought processes to understanding the world. Religious reformers had done it, analyzing Scripture. Now, Enlightenment thinkers expanded that to consider economic activity, such as Adam Smith, political activity, think of Rousseau, and they began developing a set of ideas which came to be hallmarks of, I don't want to say just Western society because their prevalence really is global now, a set of ideas that came to be identified with modernity, the importance of the individual. Now, how are we to think about society? Well, in the past, people thought about society in terms of kin groups, clientage relationships, but now, increasingly, they are thinking in terms of the individual. And this doesn't mean, oh, that suddenly people no longer think of themselves as belonging to extended kin groups, et cetera. No. It just means that increasingly they see themselves as individual actors. And depending upon the society, it will take on increasing importance. Rationalism. Again, the idea of using rational thought to analyze the world and improve it. Better political systems, better production systems. And the concept of democracy, call it popular sovereignty, that now what gives the stamp of legitimacy to a political institution is not divine guidance, not a divine imprimatur, but rather the approval of the general populace. And this doesn't necessarily mean that it will all be accomplished through elections, but nevertheless, the basic idea for any state is that it rules in the name of the people. You might be running a totalitarian communist state, and maybe you've never held an election, but you will still say, look, the reason our state is legitimate is because it works for the benefit of the people. Now, popular sovereignty becomes another critical element in the creation of modern societies. Another evolution in global systems was the decline of trading empires giving way to the rise of colonialism in the 19th and first half of the 20th centuries. And there is a logic that underpins this transition. Trading empires, well, they might accumulate some territory, particularly the Spanish and the New World, were mostly focused on the idea of creating closed systems to create monopolies over precious goods, such as spices. But the basic economic function of large state systems was changing. As capitalist production, modern factory production came to the fore. Now the critical issue is not can the state create a monopoly over spices in the Indian Ocean, but can the state ensure access to raw materials and markets for these emerging engines of mass production. Now, of course, economics was not the only reason for the rise of colonialism, but it helps us understand the transition from trading empires to colonial empires. Other factors included racism in Europe, the belief that white people were superior to others, and also the disruption of societies outside of the West, in part as a result of their encounters with the West, in part due to internal factors. One such example is, of course, the Portuguese encounter with the Kingdom of the Congo in Western Africa. The Mani Congo, the king, embraces the Portuguese as a way of relieving himself of the necessity of consulting local religious figures, and also because European weapons bring him a new power that he did not have before. But the underlying basis of this relationship, the slave trade, helps undermine and destabilize this African kingdom in less than 2 centuries. The British in India, although they first go there essentially simply to create a trading empire with a few outposts, such as at Gujarat. Although they first go to create a trading empire, they take advantage of disintegration within the Mughal Empire. The battle between Zamindars and Mansabdars to assert their power and to eventually subordinate India as a colony of Britain. So, while yes, the basic underlying drive is to secure markets and resources, nevertheless, another important factor was disintegration in many of these regions that created opportunities for the Europeans. And the fact that they could take advantage of them was because the Europeans, for a brief period, even though they thought this was going to be, permanent superiority, but for a brief period, European states did control technologies that gave them an enormous advantage in terms of controlling vast areas and carrying out military operations. Steamboats, railroads, telegraph, telephone, wireless communication, and of course, various and sundry industrially produced weapons. These advantages fed into the Europeans' search for resources and markets and allowed them to take advantage of situations where instability did occur in various parts of the world, whether it's Africa, Asia, or elsewhere. So there's a unique intersection of factors that make the creation of this colonial empire or empires possible. As for colonialism itself, its first and most obvious impact and characteristic was direct political control, to essentially decapitate the ruling political elite and impose, at least at the top, direct European control. Of course, as with most empire builders, the European colonial powers did not want to control each and every aspect of these non-Western societies. It was simply too vast and too expensive a project. So, of course, they went about educating a certain part of the population to assist them. At the same time, in order to achieve the output of the resources that they desired, the Europeans encouraged the spread of forced labor to get people working in mines and agricultural enterprises. So forced labor becomes another key characteristic of the colonial empires. And of course, the production of these raw materials, these primary goods, were designed specifically for the export of those goods to Europe. So the economies that fall under the control of the colonial powers are focused on the production and export of primary goods, mineral products, agricultural products, etc. So as the capitalist West reaches out to the rest of the world in the form of colonialism, what it's doing is creating systems that are geared not to industrialization of the sort that Europe had experienced, but rather to the creation of economies that will supplement the capitalist development in Europe itself. What we've been seeing now in the 20th and 21st centuries is a shift in that pattern as more and more of industrial production shifts to shipyards in Brazil, textile factories in China, and so forth. But that was not the intent by any means of the colonial powers. As far as transforming these populations, again, the European colonialists had fairly limited goals. Yes, they worked significantly to convert populations to Christianity, but this was by no means a mandatory process. Unlike the monarchies of early modern Europe, the rulers of 19th and 20th century Europe had no illusions about the fact that they had to convert subject populations to Christianity. So there were efforts, and in some areas they were fairly significant and influential, such as in Africa, but elsewhere in India and China, their impact was essentially minimal. As far as education, as I mentioned a moment ago, the idea was not the mass education of these populations, but rather the education of a select elite who would then work with the Europeans to help control the colonial society. So these are truly massive empires when we look at the vast territories and millions upon millions of people that they controlled. But at the same time, the ambitions of the European colonial powers were fairly limited. Create export economies, provide goods, to some degree markets, for products between Europe and the colonies. And secondly, some degree of education for a small group and conversion to Christianity on, again, a relatively voluntary basis. The last empire that we're looking at in the course, as we'll see in a minute, the American Empire, actually had far greater ambitions, not territorially, but in terms of how much influence they would have on the rest of the world. The first half of the 20th century raised some interesting questions about whether the modern world would survive. World War I demonstrated the enormous killing power of modern technology. Poison gas, machine guns, tanks, new and improved artillery proved just how murderous modern man could be. Following the war, the influenza pandemic that killed tens of millions of people across the globe also raised serious questions about, as powerful as modern technology might be, did it really have any control over the physical world? Or were there, in fact, vast parts of the physical world enormously threatening to humanity that technology could do nothing about? Then came, of course, the blow of the Great Depression, which raised very serious doubts whether capitalism itself could go on functioning or whether it was going to collapse. And as we'll see again in a moment, there were a variety of experiments seeking to achieve development without capitalism, particularly communism. The Second World War, once again, on an even grander scale, demonstrates just how deadly human beings could be towards other human beings now that they possessed these powerful and ever-growing technologies. So all of these events in the first half of the 20th century raise serious questions about whether modernity, which Westerners at least had assumed was a universal good, would in fact survive, or whether it might in fact destroy itself. So much of the 20th century, including its second half, has been spent with people dealing with the idea that perhaps modernity isn't all that it's cracked up to be. One of the things that has arisen in modern societies is totalitarianism. In some ways, rooted in the thinking of the early modern world. After all, the French Revolution, which prided itself on being truly rationalist, had imbued the state with enormous power. And increasingly, since the late 18th century, states had periodically found justifications for taking on enormous control over their economies and the lives of their citizens. For example, during the First World War, governments exercised control over how the economic system functioned, what was to be produced. They essentially eliminated, albeit temporarily, various protections for their citizens, etc. Aside from the threat of totalitarianism, of vast, uncontrolled state power, there was the reality that modern societies were marked by class conflict. The working class that had been created as a result of industrialization had seriously challenged the basic logic of capitalism, and it helped generate often radical alternatives. Gender relations were being seriously altered by the rise of the modern world. If women had economic functions, they were no longer strictly tied to household economies, such as in peasant societies, where men and women work together. They may have a division of labor over what they do exactly, but most of their work is focused on family enterprise. But now, women will be recruited in vast numbers into the industrial labor force. Questions are arising about the rights of women, challenging concepts about whether women were intended simply to be the producers of children and the tenders of home. And there was, in addition, a basic issue about the ambiguity of the modern world. And what I mean by that is that when we look back to the pre-modern world and see the influence of religion, religion provided essentially a universal explanation, gave people a sense of where they belonged in the world and how the world functioned, and what the ultimate purpose of life was, whether it was to pay homage to a particular divinity, whether there was a hereafter that might offer paradise. But there were absolute explanations and a giving to people of a sense of where they fit in the larger scope of things. But the modern world doesn't really offer that. Modernity, for all of its achievements with capitalism, with the rise of modern states and modern technology, really doesn't pretend to offer ultimate explanations. I mean, there is no, no one said, well, if you go on industrializing and doing this and doing that, you'll ultimately create a perpetual paradise for all mankind. And you will satisfy all the concerns and desires and fears of people around the world. There are no such absolute answers in modernity. Modernity offers, look, we can increase material production, we can offer this kind of diversion, et cetera, but we don't offer absolute answers. It just, we don't. That's not what rational analysis is about. In the face of these challenges, the road to modernity often led to radical and repressive consequences. When modernity arose in societies which already had fairly repressive social systems, such as in Germany, with the repression of the peasants in Germany as of the 16th century. The type of capitalist system that emerged as a result responded to crises of war and depression with a totalitarian solution, the totalitarian solution of fascism, which offered its own version of absolute answers. You worried about class conflict, kid? Don't worry about it. We're going to kill those people. Don't worry about it. Gender relations? Don't worry about it. We've just outlawed the idea that women can go off and do what they want. We're going to create, once again, traditional family units and still offer you the material benefits of the modern world. In other contexts, when authoritarian states, such as Russia, tried to rapidly modernize, which involved the introduction of massive infusions of foreign capital and technology, among other things, they often set off radical reactions among peasants, workers, and even members of the elite and the middle class. And those radical reactions resulted in several instances in communism, another totalitarian solution to the questions about modernity. And communism's answer was, look, you, the working class, the peasants, you don't have to worry. Yes, we're going to continue down the road to material prosperity, but we're going to provide guarantees of permanent jobs, education, housing, retirement. So we'll take out all of those uncertainties that inevitably afflict modern capitalist market systems and create a paradise on earth, a worker's paradise. Of course, again, you're going to have to accept a totalitarian state that will control every aspect of your life. So here we see two attempts to resolve many of the uncertainties and questions about the modern world, both of which are totalitarian in nature. The Chinese Revolution takes it a step further as Mao seeks not just to create a system guaranteeing jobs and retirement and housing, but tries to create a society in which communal values will once again prevail, where the meritocracies that are an inevitable part of modern society, in other words, where people gain a position in society based on their education, their skills, and inevitably create new forms of hierarchy, because of course certain people at the top with certain skills, certain education will be able to dominate. People down at the lower levels of society will be under their control. These meritocracies that were common in modern society were what Mao was fighting against. He wanted to create a truly egalitarian society where everyone would be equal. So he takes the idea of workers' paradise and pushes it a step further, in many ways reaching back to the pre-modern world to say, I want to go back to where community becomes the predominant concern of human beings, and that they will work energetically to benefit all of society rather than simply their individual ambitions. As Mao is experimenting with the sort of ultimate version of communism, the colonial structures are collapsing. As we've seen, national liberation movements in Africa, Asia, Middle East throw off European colonial control. And dozens upon dozens of new nation states emerge. A radical reordering of the way the world looked just 100 years earlier. These new societies not only stress a sense of nationhood, something that they picked up as a part of modernity, because where does nationalism come from? It comes from events such as the French Revolution. Not only are they going to organize themselves now along that very modern concept, but they're also going to seek the kinds of economic development, which in the middle of the 20th century basically meant industrialization. They're going to try to industrialize just as the West had. And they are going to pursue economic nationalism to achieve that goal. They're going to try to wall themselves off from the world economy so that they can develop protective industries, so they will have their own industrial base and will no longer have to rely simply on the export of primary products. So the world at mid-century looks like a pretty divided place. Not only is the world divided between capitalism and communism, with most of the world's population living in either capitalist or communist societies, but there is this third way that rejects both extremes and argues for national development without the extremes of communism, but at the same time fending off the idea that they must serve simply the interests of the larger global capitalist system. So the world seems to be fragmented and heading in several different directions at the same time. In this environment, one society emerges as the catalyst to further push modernization on a global basis. In many ways, the Americans are the heirs to the Europeans, although their own mission differs in significant ways, as we will see. They are, in fact, the heirs to that mission. Initially, the Americans saw their goal in the world as one of spreading a reborn, reformed Christianity. They themselves, many of them at least, had come to the New World precisely to escape what they felt were the corrupted practices of Christian religion in Europe. And they also wanted to spread their form of republican or elected representative government. In this way, already, they were distinguishing themselves from the Europeans because already their mission was exhibiting greater ambition than that of the Europeans. The Europeans pretty much look at, we want to control these places politically, we want to be able to exploit them economically, and other than that, we just want to make sure there's stability. The Americans have ideas about spreading their religion, spreading their political system around the world, even early in the 19th century. By the late 19th and early 20th century, that mission has further expanded. to focus on spreading American versions of modernity. So it isn't just Christianity, although Christian missionaries from America are active, Latin America, Asia. It's spreading an entire set of American ways of doing things, and especially as typified by American corporations. American corporations, lots of technology, ambitious, aggressive, rational. We know how to organize. We know how to be productive. The state, well, not terribly powerful at that time, is anxious to promote the spread of American corporations, not only for, obviously, the economic benefits of the American economy, but also because it believes it is an important influence in spreading American ideas about individualism, competition, rationalism. When the Great Depression hits, an alliance of high-tech corporations, Democratic Party, big labor, align themselves to undertake a mission of modernization, to open up the world economy, to spread American concepts of individualism, competitiveness, and, of course, a very unique American cultural phenomenon in its intensity, consumerism, the idea that human happiness is a direct product of the consumption of material goods and services. This is the American mission of the 20th century. This is globalization. And apparently, in the closing decades of the 20th century, despite communism, despite economic nationalism in much of the Third World, the American mission seems to be succeeding. The walls seem to be tumbling down. Neoliberalism, that believes free markets should dictate not only economic choices, but political decisions, social policy, appears to be winning across the world. Consumerism spreads to every corner of the globe. And there appears to be, indeed, a triumph of this American mission, which we often describe simply as globalization. But of course, it's far more complex than that. It is a process of, in some cases, absorbing American ideas, methods, values. In other cases, outright rejection, particularly of what was seen as American economic domination, and at other times over cultural issues, such as the issue of secularism in Islamic societies, and other times adaptation. Yes, we do consume American products, but we don't necessarily assign the same cultural, psychological value to them as do Americans. As a result, we don't have simply the triumph of Americanization or globalization. We have a complex interaction between these forces of modernization, which may now be driven by Americans more than other societies, but we also have reactions to it. Mass mobilizations against globalization by people affected adversely in terms of their economic lives. Cultural conflicts, as I mentioned, in terms of conflict between Islam and American ideas of secularism. Do we have a global community? Not really. A global culture? In a material sense, yes. But as I suggested last time, American cultures maintain, or I should say world cultures maintain, much of their distinctiveness. This is a process that's been going on for thousands of years. Human cultures are created by not only their own participants, but by those people also adapting, absorbing from the outside. So what we have are still a series of distinct human cultures within the context of an increasingly common global material culture. As to where this may all lead, as again I suggested last time, perhaps more powerful than the American economy, more powerful than the Chinese economy, may be the power of global climate change, a process which set off the events leading to modernity some 500 years ago. Thanks. Your turn.